Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. This week, we are doing a part 2 to a little series on education. I had my episode that came out in March about the Department of Education, and after that, I really wanted to get a more complete view. So I've been looking for other people that are wrapped up in education, people that can talk about school boards, or in this case, just what it's like to be a public school teacher in this day and age. So I'm super excited to be talking to Sam Smeaton. Sam is the host of All the Things That Matter, a podcast covering the intersections of culture, education, and religion in America. He is a veteran educator and currently teaches U.S. history in Texas, where he also coached football for 10 years. He holds a bachelor's degree from West Texas A&M University and a master's degree from Lincoln Christian University. He and his wife, Allie, also have 2 sons. Sam uses his platform to promote education reform, human rights, democracy, and conversations on Christianity and religious issues in America. I'm super excited to be talking to Sam. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Sam, thank you so much for being here. It is great to have you on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. And I got to say, I'm a fan of what you're doing. I think you're doing a great job.
It's great to have a public school teacher on. I've been really waiting to do this episode and wanting to do this episode for so long. And it's feel like going to be really great to get your perspective on everything.
Hopefully.
All right. So let's start pretty broad. Over the last, say, 5 years, COVID has completely changed the way that so many people view education in a variety of different ways. For you, how do you feel that student needs have changed over the last few years?
The general learning gap from COVID is obviously something that it is ever present, and it shows up in various ways. It shows up in reading comprehension. It shows up in attention span. It shows up in even the reliance on devices for kids, for their phones, which was already a problem. But I mean, we all spent most of lockdown looking at screens, and they were doing it at a very impressionable age. So that definitely has become more of a challenge. I think that mental health, obviously, I mean, we all know that mental health is ever present as an issue in public schools and really in the broader society. But definitely anxiety and depression in young people has had a remarkable uptick. I think that the kids felt isolated, and that ceaseless labor of comparison on social media and the seemingly unwavering panic, during COVID, whether it was the George Floyd stuff, political upheaval, the election of 2020, like even if they were young, they were still absorbing all that. So there's kind of this more existential worry about the broader world. So kids are just more anxious. They are more prone to negative self-talk. They're more prone to depression. And those really do present pretty enormous challenges.
Yeah. Do you think problem solving is another one that kind of affected students over the last few years?
Yeah, I can see that. I think that to the degree that I think kids are willing to stick with something that's tough and doesn't have a very conspicuous solution and to see it through, they struggle with that. If there's not a relatively quick fix, there is a lack of resilience that shows up. And that can be frustrating because I think we can make that observation. I think a lot of people in education have the wrong remedy for that problem.
Yeah.
Sometimes the response is, well, they just got to toughen up. Be tougher, which is not wrong in and of itself. I prefer resilience to toughness. But I would say that being willing to stick with a problem and say, hey, this is uncomfortable and I've got to live in this uncomfortable situation and continue moving forward. I've definitely had a notable change in that.
That for me is the one that I've noticed. I worked and still do work at a pool restaurant where most of the employees are high schoolers. So they were, say, 13, 14 when COVID hit, middle school typically. And the lack of problem solving skills is always, as the years go on and they were younger and younger during COVID, I see it more and more prevalent. So that's the one that I always catch. And I think about what if they're in school, how is that affecting them? And it's so much more than just the problem solving skills as you brought up, but that's the one that I've always noticed.
Yeah, and especially when that problem solving is coupled with a difficult task academically, whether it's, I teach an AP course, so there's a lot of reading and interpreting and annotating, and stuff is hard. And so they do struggle with wanting to shut down in those situations. Now, a lot of my kids are high achievers, so they push through, but it is definitely hard for them.
Right.
When something is going to, when a task is going to take a lot out of you and you have to think creatively to reach a conclusion, yeah, I definitely see it. And it's interesting that you say that. I hadn't really thought about that just because I'm kind of, my head's buried in the academic world, but seeing the kids out in the world and at their jobs, that's interesting. I would be interested to see how it manifests in those environments, just those day-to-day at work problems and issues they come up against. I hadn't really thought about that.
I've instituted a thing where if they ask me something where they clearly haven't taken the time to like try and problem solve for it themselves, I'll say, let's take a pause. What do you think we should do next to answer that question? 9 times out of 10, they'll do it. But I'm like, I am not, I understand I am your manager, but I'm not, just the question answerer.
Well, that's spoken kind of like a teacher. Honestly, I mean, you've got to make them, they have to have their own legs under them. I mean, you want to support, but they can't be asking for that kind of support every time an issue comes up.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think, or is there a part of the job that you think the general public doesn't see or understand about being a public school teacher?
I think that probably there's kind of two things that are kind of side by side with this. I think one would be just the work schedule itself, and how that goes across with all teachers get summers off, right? It's all kind of two parts of the same thing for me. On one hand, within the school year, when you think about what teachers are, what it actually takes to do the job well, it doesn't take much to do it poorly. I think that's what some people realize. Can this job be easy? Sure. It can be pretty easy if you want to clock in, clock out, do your thing, yeah. But to do it well and all that's required to prepare materials, to assess, to grade, to align, all of that requires an insane amount of time. And for the most part, most teachers don't get more than 40 to 45 minutes of personal planning time a day within the school day. And that's actually what we're paid for. We're not paid for the months in the summer. And that's why these two things go together. Like, what do teachers actually get paid for? The time that we're there, right? Those contract hours. And those contract hours include very little prep time relative to what's needed. And so that's why teachers are always getting there at the crack of dawn and staying late and going up on the weekends and doing stuff over the summers, because the actual time that we're paid for, there's not much prep time built into that. And I think people don't recognize that a lot. We are paid for a 9-month contract that's stretched over 12 months, at least in Texas. We're not paid for 12 months of work. We're paid for 9 months of work. And all of us that are trying are doing a lot more than 9 months of work. So I think that's something that's a little bit invisible. We're not just seeing our classes and going home and staying a half hour to grade papers. The time required within the day for what is needed. I mean, I served just this past year, and I was still coaching this last year. So I had 140 students in the classroom that I was responsible for. Then I had another 85 freshman football players, right? So, and all of this, what are we actually getting paid for? Is a lot of it spills beyond that. So the amount of time we have to prepare what we need to do, and the fact that the summer, we're not paid for the summer, and yet most of us are working in the summer. Those are things that I think the general public probably may not have the best sense of if you're not around people who are in public ed.
And excuse my ignorance on this, but does something like that, like the having to take time outside of your contracted hours, get less significant the more years you are a teacher? In my head, I'm assuming that you're, kind of reusing lesson plans and just making smaller alterations, or does it get worse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you're teaching at the same spot and you're teaching the same content, yes, the early years are going to be the hardest. If you're going to be teaching the same course for a long period of time, you are going to find a rhythm. You're going to have your basic materials, and you're going to be tweaking every year, obviously, and every week, but you're going to have a baseline to work from. So I would say that it's probably harder for new teachers for sure, because you're trying to get everything at the beginning. But for the most part, most of us we're undergoing a lot of changes, whether that's in the courses that we're teaching, the size of those sections. A lot of teachers have 2 preps. And that's what I think a lot of people may also not realize is a lot of teachers are not just teaching one class. For a good chunk of my career, I've done, maybe it's, a couple of periods of U.S. government, a couple of periods of U.S. history. The last spot I was at, I taught 2 sections of freshman geography and then 3 sections of senior government. So it might be that you have your stuff for your bread and butter, but then this next year, hey, you've got 2 sections of this other class now. So now that gets added on top of it. So there's a lot of variance there, but yes, generally speaking, early on is the hardest.
Yeah. I do think that some of the stuff you mentioned about like teachers not getting paid for their contract hours, that's something I learned like on the internet over the last maybe few years. So I do feel like the information is out there if you want to find it, but it really just depends on like where you end up on the internet. And I do think the other thing for me that I find really troubling is that there's a lot of teachers that have second jobs, especially over the summer.
A ton. And that's what, it's weird. Anytime that I see teachers working second jobs, like I have this weird, this is strictly just me, I kind of have this almost indignant reaction or maybe a resentful reaction. Like, why should they have to do that? And sometimes, look, teachers, like some people just like it. Like some people, you know, they have a friend that has a business and they enjoy doing it and they want to get that work in. That's all totally fine. You know, I podcast over the summer, right? We all do something. But the fact that teachers would need to, given the amount of time and work that they put into their teaching job, the fact that they'd have to do something else to make ends meet is personally really offensive to me, if I'm being real. I think it's extremely offensive, and it's not something that you see in a lot of countries around the world. We talk about the Nordic countries a lot, but I mean, teachers kind of have a social and economic status in countries like that are pretty similar to doctors and lawyers, right? They're highly specialized. They all have graduate degrees. They're making a six-figure type salary, you know, because value is attached to what they're doing, like economic, social value. And you don't necessarily see that here. So you got teachers that are doing extra jobs. In the world of Texas high school football, where I've spent the last 10 years, where not only are we all teachers and coaches, but the hours in football season in Texas are astonishing. I mean, and so, you know, you're working in season anywhere from a 12 to a 16-hour day. And then there are 7 days a week in a lot of cases. And then you also have guys that are driving Ubers at night on top of that. And so that always just struck me as like, this is so utterly wrong. And I think we're a little bit numb to it. Sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, like you were talking about, like other countries where they're held in the same regard as doctors, lawyers, like having to have a second job, I feel like in some ways takes the dignity away from it, like away from the person. Like,
because what you're doing is not enough. You need to be doing more. Yeah.
Right. And you know, all work is dignified, of course, but generally might be too woke of an opinion, but people shouldn't have to work second jobs. If you have a full-time job, it should be paying you enough to live comfortably.
That seems pretty fundamental to me. The notion that anybody working full-time should be in that situation is pretty crazy, and that goes beyond education. Given what the responsibility is placed on teachers and how consequential the profession is and how much blood, sweat, and tears it takes to be good at it, it is pretty personally offensive to me that teachers would have to work a second job. If they just want to do something else, fine. That they would have to, because financially there's a deficit there, is insane to me.
Right. So kind of going off of that, what kind of support do you and your students currently receive, and where do you think support is kind of lacking and you could use it more? Yeah,
so there's the broader areas, I think, in the United States where we're all lacking in. Most schools are underfunded, regardless of what you hear. And again, that kind of ties back to your earlier question about the disconnect. When we talk about schools being underfunded, most people outside public ed don't know what that really means. It means that maybe this school doesn't have a diagnostician. Or maybe there's not enough counselors, right? Or maybe there's not even a full-time nurse on this campus. A lot of times that is what it can look like. And you can call that support in the sense that your support staff is so vital. Your paraprofessionals, your co-teachers, your teachers' assistants, your special ed assistants, like those people mean the world to the system. And when schools can't afford to pay those people, we just don't have them. Even as much as just having good, consistent substitutes, which is a crisis here in Texas. That is an area where I think that is something people maybe don't see, that we don't have. Yeah, we've got the teaching spots filled sometimes, but even if we have all the teaching spots filled, a lot of times that support staff is lacking. Now, that is going to vary by time and place, obviously. I'm in a relatively good spot in terms of that. We have pretty good support in that respect, but we still need more. The investment that's required for the mental and academic needs of our kids is huge. And we need more investment in that everywhere. And honestly, a lot of times it's rural districts, it's smaller districts where they are in the most trouble, in those places where teachers are wearing way too many hats. I've had friends that took, for professional advancement, took either head coaching jobs or administration jobs in smaller towns and end up leaving because they get there and it's like, it's not just a coaching job, it's in everything. job. Like
Right.
I'm having to do so many different things here and wear so many different hats, and that I get burned out in 6 months. So that support staff thing is an area where I think public ed is always struggling. And really attending to, I think we need more counselors. I think we need more school psychiatrists, given the mental health issues that I was talking about earlier. The kids are more anxious and depressed than they have ever been. And a lot of times we don't necessarily have the resources to pour into that. We're just sticking Band-Aids on the results of these problems. And so I would say that would be a major issue, just support staffing, non-teacher professionals that we need.
Right.
And I would also say if you get on any website where teachers like to vent, or if you get on like the teacher subreddit or any place like that.
I find myself there frequently. I don't know why. I've never been interested in being a teacher, but there I am. And it's usually like the craziest post too. And I'm like, okay.
It's amazing. They'll totally hook you. But you've probably seen too that like there's a disconnect in the general administrative culture of education and in the teacher side of it. A lot of times the old adage is that, well, you go into administration too long and you lose touch with what it was like to be in the classroom. There is truth in that, but a lot of times, a lot of teachers don't feel like their time is respected. They don't feel like what they're asked to do in terms of either professional development or mandatory trainings or meetings that they're required to attend, that they don't see much benefit from. That creates a disconnect, I think, between public ed administration and public ed teachers. And again, that is very much dependent on time and place. You can't generalize too heavily on this stuff. But I will say that it does come up over and over again from teachers all over the country that talk about this. They feel like, I shared a meme the other day. It was Denzel Washington from Flight when he's testifying and he's about to tell them all that he's still drinking and he's an alcoholic, and he's like, God help me. And the caption was, when administration breaks out the Sharpies and the poster boards at professional development, because we're about to write something on here and do some activity. A lot of teachers feel that way. They feel like, I don't want to do this stuff. Like there's other things I could be doing with this time. And again, I'm saying that based on having gone to national conferences and having to have been plugged in these communities online. There's a disconnect, I think, between what a lot of times administration wants teachers to do and what they feel like they should be doing. That's an issue. And I also think that's a reason that sometimes people leave. I think there's a lot of reasons teachers leave the profession, but when they don't feel like their time is being adequately respected or that their professional expertise is being respected by the people above them, they leave. And I've seen it over and over again. And I've watched a lot of good teachers leave the profession because of that.
Right. And nowadays, the conversation is always about money. Cheapest solution. So Are there any small or low cost things that you think would significantly improve public school classrooms? At
the risk of being redundant, an unbelievable amount would be improved by simply giving teachers more paid planning and prep time. And now, is that low cost? It depends, right? But if I'm to think about to really improve their classrooms, what do teachers really need? They need time. Teachers need time. And whether that's low cost or not can be debatable, and I understand that. But a lot of times, that extra time allows you to put together that really constructive activity that you didn't have time to put together, But along with that, a lot of teachers, are you familiar with Teachers Pay Teachers?
Yes. I've ended up on that side of TikTok once or twice.
Yeah. So that for people that may not know, that's basically a site where teachers share their materials and resources, and we basically buy and sell from each other. Teachers are spending a lot of their own money on stuff. A lot of times on things that are not that expensive. Maybe it's that there's a collection of worksheets, or there's video study guides for something, or there's selected pages from a particular textbook that you can use for various activities. That kind of stuff is usually, teachers might pay $5-10 for that stuff, but we're doing it out of our own pocket because a lot of times we don't have those things. So again, you can debate whether this stuff is really in the macro low cost when all teachers need it. But on the micro level, it certainly is. For a teacher that, especially in some states, we have it relatively good in Texas compared to our surrounding states. Teachers in Oklahoma, New Mexico, their pay is extremely low. So if they're dropping $25 this week for a resource, well, that actually might be pretty significant for a lot of teachers around the country. So a little bit more money where teachers maybe are not having to pull money out of their own pocket for resources could be enormously helpful.
Right. Well, even just like I'm dreaming big, but like a federal grant program or something where you can say here's a couple things I need. And
yeah, but that would be communism, Paige.
Sorry, my bad. Shouldn't have even brought it up. Yeah, I mean, I'm from Chicago, so my view's a little bit jaded because we have the Chicago Teachers Union, and that's a big thing. I didn't go to Chicago public schools growing up, but in my mind, like, I've always been in a place where public schools are generally well funded. And I understand that it's not like that all over the city of Chicago. But it's, as I got older and I started to see things on the internet about like what teachers do, what they go through, whatever, and I watched some of my peers become teachers, it's disheartening in a way that, like, you know, you go to public school. I went to public school for most of my life, and you look up to your teachers and you look at the classroom that they've built for you, and you think about, you know, what a cute little space it was and how engaging that teacher is. And then you grow up and you find out that they were probably struggling
absolutely
to either make ends meet or provide for their classroom in a way that made it feel welcoming. And it's just sad. Like, it makes me so sad.
Yeah, and me too. And it can even go to that point, like teachers having to either paint their own classroom or just do basic maintenance on it. And a lot of times that is not the school district's fault. It's that the money simply is not there. It's not that there's a bunch of completely malicious, evil people at your school that say, no, we want you to not have lights and air conditioning. No, it's that the money is not there, you know? And that's why it always comes back to, we just need more money and time.
I got the air conditioning. I forgot about that. When I was in grade school, our school didn't have air conditioning. The only rooms that had air conditioning were the rooms of previously pregnant teachers.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
That's where the budget went.
That's definitely an upper Midwest thing. People would be dead down here.
Oh yeah. No. That's not possible there. But yeah. So we've talked about a lot of the challenges. How do you and your colleagues support each other through things that can be really challenging? In the first place, is there even support amongst teachers?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, there definitely is. And you were talking about unions, obviously teachers unions, and we'll get into more of what our state government does later in the conversation. But unions are not really a thing here. And even more than that, like, teachers just don't have a unionized mentality, even if there's not a particular union. But on campuses and within districts, teachers do try to take care of each other a lot, at least in my experience down here. Teachers do want to support one another whether it's covering each other's classes or whether it's sharing resources. Teachers, by and large, are pretty good about that stuff because the majority of us are, I want to say, in it for the right reasons, right? And we just want each other to do well. There is the mentality for some support is there. It's more of a localized support. There's not as much of a broad, unionized mentality down here. That varies by place in the country. But in my experience, I would say teachers are pretty good about supporting each other where we can. We want to help each other out. You rarely ever get a door slammed in your face when you need something in this profession.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but mentioned people leaving the profession. And I feel like in recent years, it's been more and more and more.
Oh, yeah.
So what keeps you and your colleagues going and continuing to teach? Like, what still brings you joy in the classroom?
For those of us that are pretty much lifers, I think that part of it is the concessions that you make early, right? The concessions you make early in your career or in college even, I'm not going to make a lot of money, right? You come out of the gate knowing that. And if you have a genuine love for young people and for these kids, teenagers are my people, like that's just, I love them. And for those of us that kind of stick it out, that we allow that to carry us through the hard times. Because at the end of the day, whatever the number is, the overwhelming majority of our kids are going to be in public schools. However broken they are, however volatile the society around them is, these kids are still going to be there. And somebody's got to be there serving them. And so that's a lot of it. And also, in my case, at least, it's a genuine passion for the content that I teach. And, history and politics are something I'm deeply passionate about. And you'll find that with the best teachers are the ones for whom their content is a labor of love, right? I don't think you have to have that because on the flip side of that, like a good teacher is a good teacher. Like if you have a good teacher and the only job you have for them is 7th grade science and they've never taught 7th grade science, if they're a genuinely good teacher, they're going to be good at it, even if it's not their thing. And that's something that's pretty cool to see too. But I think in the long term, you got to love what you're talking about each day. You have to care about what you're talking about each day. And you have to really, really have a deep and abiding love for the kids. I'm sitting here saying that now in June of 2025. If you had to ask me in June of 2015 if I thought I would get out of the coaching side, I would have said you were crazy, But the burnout got to me. And so I don't begrudge teachers who, for their mental health and for how they're relating to their families and to their homes, they needed to step back. I begrudge no one for that. Because the burnout is definitely real and it can get really discouraging. And I'm trying to remember what the numbers are, but a huge number of teachers, a shocking number of teachers don't make it to year 5. And I get it. I get it.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, again, with the question I asked about, like, does it get easier as time goes on? Like, it's not to be the person that's like, oh, tough it out until year 6, but like, it is so hard in the beginning years. Like, of course, people are gonna leave if they're not feeling supported. Like I said, I grew up looking up to my public school teachers, and I feel like part of it may be like you have this idealistic view, and of course the information is out there about the lack of pay, but you get in there and you're like, this is not what I thought this was going to be like at all.
And I think a lot of it, in fact, most of it, like one of the things that we always say when we, whether it's that in the profession that we change jobs or we go to a new place, or one of the things you hear a lot is it's rarely ever the kids that are the reason you leave a place. Now, that can't happen. There are places in America that are in extreme turmoil socioeconomically and politically where there are enormous behavior challenges and challenges with drugs and crime and everything else. I'm not saying that there's never a student-based reason that people leave, but it's usually not. It's usually because teachers do not feel heard. They are not paid enough. Their time is not respected. And yeah, when you get into that as a young professional and you're 24, 25 years old and you're still pretty idealistic, a lot of times that idealism and those dreams and that creativity is stifled by the structures of the institutions. And so, I understand why they leave early, but that it all comes back to that's why we've got to put our teachers in a better position where they don't get to year 4 and feel like I have the Sunday scaries every Sunday and I'm dreading Monday morning. Like, that's not the state of nature. It doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
But it is why a lot of young teachers get out.
Oh yeah, I see it. I believe it. And I think you're right. It does start with like a better overall support system, not just from fellow teachers, but the community, admin, like it's all a big system and they all need to be working.
Well, and I have to say, and this is something I probably was going to touch on later, but since you said that, before I forget it, like being involved in sports all these years and also in fine arts. I mean, I come from a fairly musical background as well. And so that's where you see public school and community at its best. I mean, you've heard it said before, but Friday Night Lights in Texas, there is nothing like it. There is nothing like Friday Night Football in Texas. And I spent a couple of years working in a small district where our graduating class was only about 50 kids, which was a real change of pace for me. Because I went to a large high school. I've always worked in large high schools. So that was a big shift for me. But traveling around West Texas those couple of years to these little tiny towns, the way those towns come together around sports, it's unbelievable. Whatever divisions those people have, they go to different churches. There's black folks, white folks, Hispanic folks, Asian folks, and everybody is in it together, and your kids are playing together and you're tailgating. And it's like, that's why public schools, especially in rural places, are so valuable. Like, it is a place where divisions can really fall apart and people can come together. And that can be so important. And that's one thing that I hope we never lose. And I don't know, in other parts of the country, obviously there's various things that schools do that bring people together. In Texas, a lot of times it's football, but there's a lot of different ways that can show up in communities. And that is the outside the walls value of a public school. It gives people identity and purpose and togetherness.
I've never really put much thought into what you just said before, but now that you've said it, like I said, I was in public school until 8th grade, and then I went to a private school. At both the private school that I attended and also the public school that I would have gone to had I not gone to private schools. Football was huge at both schools. And same thing, every Friday night, every home game, especially at the public school, the private school was not allowed to have stadium lights. So there was not a lot of student turnout whatever. Anyways, but at the public school, it was always a thing. And now that I'm thinking on it, like, yes, of course that builds that sense of community. And I come from a place that was not very divided racially or otherwise, but it did give that sense of like, oh, this is where everybody's going to be tonight. Anybody with a kid between the ages of 13 to 18 is going to be at the local football game. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's cool because, I was talking about the small school aspect of it, but with more of a large school background, like here in the metro area, it shocks a lot of people that aren't from here. Like a big rivalry game at a metro stadium in Texas, I mean, you're going to have 15,000 people, it can be so special and so cool. A little look at I think what we could be.
Right. And speaking of community, have you noticed shifts in, let's say, the last 10 years and how your community or students have viewed public education?
Yeah, there's definitely been, I'd say there's been shifts on multiple fronts. As far as the students are concerned, their attitude towards school has shifted, partially because of COVID and partially just because of the direction of the society in general. There's more skepticism towards institutions, even if it's subtle. Right? There was kind of this, I think, post-World War II mentality that we had a lot of times, whether it was in football or education, where it's like, you're the boss, you're the general, I'm the soldier, yes, sir, we do what you say. As that's faded over the last decades, kids are not willing to give teachers and decision makers the benefit of the doubt the way that they used to. And I actually don't think that's that much of a bad thing in most cases. It can be, obviously. But I think a lot of times, kids want to know why they're being told to do something. Like their attitude towards school is they want to, why are you asking me to do this assignment? Why are we doing this in class this many days? Out on the football field, like, why are you giving me this instruction? How does this play actually make sense? There's just more of that now. And I think some people in our profession are resistant to it. In principle, I'm not that resistant to it. I think it sharpens us. I think if kids are thinking for themselves and putting the burden of proof on authority, given the way I think the burden of proof is always on authority. So I don't mind that as much. And I think that can be a positive thing. It can also go completely sideways, obviously, right? I mean, obviously, they're teenagers. They will take it to an absurd degree at times. They'll resist things they don't need to resist. And it can cause problems, of course. But generally, I've definitely noticed that. Kids they're not going to just give the benefit of the doubt to the adult all the time. And sometimes, yes, they can be disrespectful and this and that, but we can't just wag our finger and say disrespect. Like that can inform us too and force us to be a little bit better, giving them a reason for why they're being asked to do something.
Yeah. And I've noticed, again, you're saying things that you're noticing in school. And I know kids that do that outside of school. And it's, there's always the trope of the toddler that's like, why?
Yeah.
And when it's that, like, they're doing it about something silly where I'm like, well, I don't know why, Rebecca, like, that's just the way it is. But whenever I've had a kid, whether it was at this restaurant or, I nannied for a while before I got my job, like, I've always tried to take a step back and like think critically about what I'm saying to them in response to that. Because if they're asking it about a genuine thing that they are curious about, or they, want to know your thought process behind it. Like, my biggest pet peeve growing up was when an adult would be like, because I said so.
I know, it's so, as a kid, it's a bad answer. As a kid,
right.
And then as an adult, you have to accept, okay, that is kind of a bad answer. Now, look, I'm a parent of 2 young kids. I'm not going to say I've never said because I said so, because sometimes you're tired of explaining yourself.
Right.
Just do the thing because I need you to, because I'm about to lose my mind, right?
But the overuse is the issue.
The overuse is a huge issue because it allows teachers to not be at their best, and it allows us to not think critically about what we're doing. And and what I've found, at least in my classroom experience, is one of the things I've always hung my hat on for over a decade now is wherever else I make mistakes and am deficient, my classroom culture and my relationships with my students is something I will put up against anybody. And I think a big reason for that is because I listen to my kids. I admit when I screw things up. I say I don't know when I don't know. And that builds an enormous amount of credibility in a classroom because kids say, okay, he's a human, like he's doing his best, like he genuinely has our best interest at heart and he doesn't think he's perfect. That goes a long way. It goes a long way towards actually getting kids to buy into what you're doing.
And especially with, you teach in high school, like you're teaching kids that are less than 5 years from entering adulthood. And in many cases, like entering a place where they're going to be kind of on their own or, with a safety net, but for the most part on their own.
In my first year, I was 23 years old and I was teaching 17-year-olds. Like, we're going to be adults at the same time together. Like, you know what I mean? It's
right.
I can't look down on you too far.
Right. Exactly. So, without getting too in the weeds on this, how do you feel that national or even local narratives about education directly impact your teaching environment?
Well, you're asking a Texas teacher, and as you know, we have a state government that has mounted what can only be described as an all-out assault on public education. A lot of these are goals that people in our state government have wanted to accomplish for years, like with vouchers, slowly seeing the influence of public schools recede and then be replaced by private education, and also just the use of the state and the use of public schools to push particular ideological narratives. That stuff has always been there, but it is very emboldened right now. I mean, Greg Abbott is the most anti-public education governor in the history of the state. And he may be one of the most anti-public ed governors in the country. Not maybe, he is.
Him and Ron DeSantis are just fighting for that spot.
And what's crazy about it is you ask teachers across the ideological spectrum, they mostly agree. I always have to remind people that the Texas Association of Rural Schools, which you don't get more conservative and deep red than rural Texas, right? The Texas Association of Rural Schools was very much opposed to Abbott's voucher scheme. They were on the exact same side as the large teachers organizations in Dallas and Houston and Austin. Like, most of public ed was on the same side of this stuff, but a lot of it has still come through. The voucher scheme is bad enough because of its risk of further defunding us and funneling taxpayer money into schools that are heavily ideological and have very little accountability. But it goes beyond vouchers. For instance, here, and to give people kind of an idea, what some of these state governments that are hostile to public ed will do is they'll put lipstick on a pig very much. So we just passed a bill here in Texas that did approve fairly substantial teachers' raises, right? Sounds awesome. Teachers need raises. What that conceals is the broader policy, which is that since COVID, as inflation has skyrocketed, our per student funding allotment, how much districts get per student, has not kept up remotely with inflation. So we're, by most estimates, $1,400 to $1,500 per student behind. And so what we needed was at least $1,000 increase in the per student allotment from the Texas legislature. They gave us $55 per student, 5 when we needed at least $1,400 or $1,500. And
that's like insulting.
Oh, it's an insult, and it's not even subtle. It's just a middle finger to public education. And then they slap teachers' raises on top of it and say, but look, we gave you raises. Never mind that the fact that with the trouble you're having with a per student allotment, you can't actually afford to pay anybody that's not a teacher. All those paraprofessionals I was talking about earlier, you're not going to be able to support any of that, right? You're still in crisis. And now there's a higher burden on districts, and now they have to pay you more, but they're not going to be bringing more money in. And so it's really nefarious because they're intentionally trying to obfuscate, right, the reality of what they're doing by slapping something on top of it and saying, here's a raise. Never mind that we're literally burning the institution down underneath those raises. So yeah, that's a huge problem. And there is, with regard to ideology, I mean, we don't always know what to expect or because especially when you're in social studies or history, right? Or also English and literature to a degree, you can fall victim to these ideological policies pretty quick. And to give you an example, I was standing with my AP government seniors in 2020 watching January 6th happen live on TV with my seniors, right? So the times are really volatile, and they're seeing it in real time. And part of that volatility are an attempt, I think, to chill certain conversation in classrooms, particularly in Texas. If you're going to talk about institutional racism, you have to be extremely careful. Okay, they can come after you for that from the Texas legislature. If you want to talk about something as simple as political history, right, the development of political parties, if you say certain things, you can find yourself in hot water. And anything to do with current events, you really have to watch your back if you're going to talk about current events at all in Texas, to where a lot of teachers have been just scared out of doing it, and that's the point. Right? The point is for teachers to be afraid to talk about relevant issues because it's the particular ideological narrative of the people that are in charge of Texas. And on one hand, there's a lot of positive, changes. Like 20 years ago, we didn't have African American and Mexican American studies classes in this district. We do now. And it's great. But a lot of people are asking now, what do current policies mean for that? Like, if we can teach that stuff, what can we not talk about? What's going to get us in trouble? Like, teachers often don't get clear answers to these questions, and it scares them out of particular conversations. So, and obviously now the federal government is also now reinforcing a lot of that stuff. Governor Abbott went around the state during his whole voucher push referring to teachers as educrats. Right? There's the educrat lobby. Never mind the fact that huge proportion of Texas teachers are conservatives and vote for him. And he went through his barnstorming tour around Texas and visited a bunch of private schools. He never set foot in a public school. And the reason that he didn't is because he knows what will happen if he shows up at one. He will get opposed. He is not supported there by conservatives or liberals or anybody else. So you take that existing issue and now a federal government that likes to say teachers are a bunch of communists and Stalinists and they're corrupting the youth or whatever. Mm-hmm. All that rhetoric has a very real consequence of trying to bring ideological conformity according to a small group of people. So these are real problems, and we are very much trying to navigate it. Even though the vast majority of us, and again, I can only speak to my experience, I don't have any interest or intention of telling kids how to vote. That's not my job. Right. It's not my job to promote political parties in my classroom. No intention of doing it. It's the fact that other things that probably didn't used to be really seen as controversial now might be under the gun. Very few teachers think it's their job to tell their kids who they should be voting for. I don't do it. Most teachers don't do it. What we are afraid of is that fruitful historical conversations can be limited. So when you take all that together, the funding, the vouchers, the ideology, it does shift public conversation and it affects people's votes. I could go on and on. I'll stop myself because this is a soapbox for me.
The feeling like you can, and also in some ways not being able to talk about certain topics, is such a disservice to just the community at large, especially if kids are asking about it. If they're asking their teacher about it, they're clearly not getting that conversation at home. Or they'd talk to their parents about it. Maybe they have parents that aren't engaged in this type of thing, which is fine. But where's the next place they're going to ask?
Well, and maybe this is an area where I'm naive, but I would think that most teachers have the sensibility. If a kid wants to know what's going on with this, what are people saying? We don't have to sway them. Just tell them what people are saying. Here's what these politicians are saying. Here's what these politicians are saying. Here's the issue. Here's what this bill says, right? There it is. Now you go run with it and you figure out what you think about it.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you what to think about it. That seems pretty fundamental to me.
No, that's liberal brainwashing. Haven't you heard?
Exactly. Like even doing that. So, and again, maybe that's naivete because I'm not in other teachers' classrooms all the time. Maybe teachers do have a problem maintaining objectivity. Look, in certain areas, I get that. But if kids are just asking about current or historical events, like that's a part where we get them to go discover things. We give them information. We give them a framework where they run with and they go make up their own minds.
So you've talked a little bit about kind of navigating the growing pressure on ideologies in the classroom. Can you talk a little bit more about some specific laws, like the ones requiring the 10 commandments in classroom or these new voucher programs that have been popping up seemingly everywhere? How do those types of efforts affect your classroom and also the students that are in those classrooms?
Well, it's really interesting that you bring up the 10 commandments thing because that is going to be so unprecedented. And granted, it's going to be tied up in court for a long time, I would guess. But putting that in the classroom is automatically going to trigger a ton of conversations that I don't even think most schools are going to be comfortable with the conversations. The kids are going to be talking about it. The teachers are going to be talking about it. They're going to be airing religious opinions. How that could be seen as a good thing is a little beyond me. So that's one law that's very divisive. And, one of the most vocal opponents of that law down here and one of the most vocal opponents in our legislature on vouchers is James Tallarico, who is a devout Christian in our Texas state legislature who's been the foremost critic of a lot of these policies. And so you also have like an intra-Christian disagreement on stuff like this. And so it's even divisive among those that are devout. And so it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. In terms of the voucher thing, one of the most disappointing things is a lot of people in our legislature who we really thought were pro-public ed. In the last 5 years, we've watched them completely do an about-face on that to serve Greg Abbott. And what was great about it is we had politicians down here who, obviously down here, a lot of Republicans run unopposed in our neck of the woods, right? Just because it's so overwhelming. I mean, our Republicans in statewide races here in our part of Texas get 80% of the votes. But a lot of times, people of all sorts of persuasions voted for these guys, especially in public ed, because they had always had our back. They opposed vouchers. They supported teacher pay. There was unity around this issue, right? Whatever else we disagreed about politically, religiously, whatever else, we kind of came together around public schools in a lot of times. That has changed. And people who have been anti-voucher and who have been pro-public school in the last 2 or 3 legislative sessions have completely reversed themselves. From my vantage point, my own representative and many others who supported this voucher scheme, I think they were simply afraid of being primaried by the governor. I mean, the governor basically threatened to primary anybody who opposed his agenda. And so the effects of these voucher programs are going to be a little bit longer term. Does enrollment go down? Right? If you're a relatively small district and even a handful of your kids, like for instance, the last school I was at that had a 50, 55 kid graduating class, right? If 12 kids go to private school, that's going to hurt you. If your enrollment drops by a little bit, it's going to hurt you. And so what we have to see is longer term, what kind of effects are we going to see if enrollment drops as a result of the voucher schemes? Because if enrollment drops, you're losing the allotment from those kids. You're going to lose funding, and then your support staff further thins out. Which is why many people down here think that's not a bug in the system. That's the plan. It's the slow destruction of public ed, right? So in terms of policies that directly affect instruction, you do see some. You see, bans on teaching critical race theory, however that group of people wants to define that, which is we know that, I don't know what that means to the people that write these laws. I mean, I kind of do because I read the bills, but they just put names on things, DEI, critical race theory, anti-American, communist, and once they slap these labels on and say schools can't do this, that does affect instruction.
Right. Well, and especially without providing, like you said, without providing a definition, you're leaving the room for interpretation, one, by the law and people that would reprimand teachers, which then in turn makes teachers go, well, I guess if I think hard enough about this could be considered that arbitrary label that they slapped on, and now I'm not going to teach it.
And that's why I like to use the term to chill classroom discussion. It just makes it less likely that people in education are going to be willing to talk about certain things. And that's the plan. It is trying to create ideological conformity, which is so funny to me because I can't think of anything less conducive to a free society than the government trying to implement ideological conformity.
Right. And I feel like the whole argument is, parents' involvement in, their kids' education, which on its face is not necessarily a bad thing, that parents be involved in their kids' education. However, to then, use that to limit what your kid is learning and experiencing in schools is a little bit wild, because when kids go to school, that might be the only place where they are being exposed to somebody that is different than them. When you're at home, you're in your bubble. You're in whatever your parents tell you. And when you go to school, that's your opportunity to learn and grow. I had Jasmine Bolton on from the Department of Education who talked about how public schools are really a child's first introduction to what democracy is.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's so true. So the whole thing is, one, infuriating. And two, it stunts kids. Like, these plans aren't helping anybody except for the people making the laws.
When people have the idea that public schools are not supposed to be for everybody, that's the whole point. And that was a lot of the pushback on this 10 Commandments thing, right? Sure, most Texans identify as Christian. Everybody knows that. That's not the question. The question is, are public schools for everyone? Whether they are religious, non-religious, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. When you don't believe that public schools are for everyone. And look, a lot of people don't. One thing that the current political climate has given us is people who really don't believe in pluralism are saying so, right? They don't necessarily want perspectives to be equally heard. And that seems pretty anathema to education to me. Again, it's not about telling kids what to believe. It's saying, here is what is out there. And now you go discover and you make up your own mind.
So, to kind of start to wrap things up, if you could speak directly to the public and say one thing about public schools that you just really wish that everybody in the general public would understand, what would it be?
Well, I would start broad and say, just as a kind of a philosophical statement, that without a free, robust public education, you're not going to have a free society very long. Public school, and I don't think that's controversial. That's something that conservatives have historically embraced. Some of the most pro-public ed folks that we have in Texas are deeply conservative. So this is something that crosses divides. So that's the larger philosophical point, right? Is that without free and robust public education, I don't even know what kind of society we have. But it will not be one that's for everybody. But I would say when you hear teachers and teachers unions and public ed advocates talk about the funding crisis, we're not just talking about throwing money into a vacuum, right? We're talking about we need more support staff. We need more school psychologists. We need more mental health professionals. We need more paraprofessionals. We need teachers to have more paid time to do their jobs to the best of their ability. Teachers are hemorrhaging from the profession. And some people might see that and some people might not. But that is a sign of an institution in crisis. A lot of educated, empathetic, intelligent, passionate people are leaving because they can't do it anymore. Because they don't have the time, they don't have the support, and they don't have the funding. So when we advocate for public schools, we're not just saying fire a money cannon at us. Obviously, we have to spend it on the right things, right? But that is the issue. Like, the issue is we need more money, more time, and more support in order to serve the community. Because at the end of the day, and this is what I'm always trying to get across to people, Public education has every problem, every societal ill is dropped on our doorstep, whether it is poverty, discrimination, whatever the issue is. It gets dropped on our doorstep and we get told, hey, deal with it all day, every day, right? And we can't impact the other institutions in society as directly. We can't do comprehensive immigration reform, right? We can't do comprehensive economic healthcare or economic reform or healthcare reform. We can't do that stuff. So what we have to do is be given the tools to deal with the struggles that our kids are having. And so long as we have the major institutional problems we have in this country, there's got to be more funding and more time given to schools to serve those needs.
Again, you're saying things where I'm like, oh my God, he's so right. Every societal ill ends up in a public school most of the time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't feel like teachers are then equipped to be like, well, how do I deal? Here's how you deal with poverty. Here's how you deal with a person that has a family of mixed immigration status. Like,
yeah, exactly. And you know, we have more of those trainings than we used to, but still, broadly speaking, it's not remotely, sufficient for teachers to, most teachers down here are not bilingual. I'm not bilingual and I should be, right? Like these are things that, I'm in a border state, for crying out loud. So there is that. And I'm always reminded of these little things that we pick up and learn along the way in terms of those societal ills being dropped on our doorstep. Kids are physiologically affected by poverty and by discrimination and their ability to even encounter the school environment. That deck is stacked so far against them by the time they get to us that if you want better outcomes, you got to give us a shot.
Right. Absolutely. So last question, what do you hope that the future of public education looks like, both for students and for teachers?
Well, in addition to what I was just saying in terms of just the institution being made more stable, well-funded, I would say we need to move a little bit away from a model that still largely is kind of an industrial revolution model of education, right? Where it's kind of a pipeline, sit in rows, do what you're told, be quiet, and then do that for 12 years and then go do your thing. We need more free inquiry. We need kids to have more freedom to explore actual problems in the world, to address authority as it exists in the world, and try to creatively think about ways that they can improve it when they come of age. Solution finding. We talked about problem solving earlier. Understanding and sensing the sufferings of people in the society and how we can help to alleviate it. I'm not going to say that vocational training in school is bad, because it's clearly not. However, when education is seen as a pipeline to economic activity and nothing else, which is how some people think about it, you lose a lot of this stuff. And so it needs to be both, right? We need to, we just, in our community in the last 10 years, we've built a huge multi-million-dollar vocational technical high school that a lot of our kids go to for part of the day. It's great. I'm a huge supporter of it. We just need to have that, and we need to have this broader inquiry about society and institutions, where we hope that these kids create a better world than the one we live in. I don't see that as being controversial. I don't think it's controversial to say, you guys need to help us fix what's broken when you come of age. And that's going to require a little bit of a different approach than just sit there, be quiet, and do what you're told for 12 years.
Right. Well, that's what I think a lot about, like the rise in, I think it's Montessori schools that encourage individual like problem solving and all that stuff. Like, I think that might be indicative of parents that are now having kids that are like, I don't want my kid to sit sit here, do what you're told, listen to everything that we say, and do all of that, and then go build something in a factory, whatever it is.
Right. And then if you do really well, you can go create value for the shareholders, right?
Right.
There might, and again, okay, I don't want this to come across as if I'm shaming vocational training or job skills. I'm not. It's got to be both.
Right.
It's got to be both. Any education system worth its salt has to be both.
Right. I think, well, that's what I find so frustrating about the like college discourse of like, they're brainwashing everybody. Everybody should go to trade school. Okay, well, not everybody. What kind of society is that, where we end up with millions and millions of plumbers, that doesn't solve anything.
Well, and you know what another interesting observation about that is, and this is, I tell my U.S. history students this sometimes, is the people that were politically active and reformers and were highly literate and engaged in the arts, a lot of times in the industrial period, those weren't people that had any education. They were the tradesmen, right? It blows my kids' minds when I tell them that there was a time where, a blacksmith in Boston would literally hire a teenage age boy to read classic literature to him while he worked. That's something that actually happened back then. The factory girls in Massachusetts they created their own labor press, right? These are 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old girls with maybe the equivalent of a third grade education, writing their own newspapers and advocating for better conditions in the workplace and for reforms.
Right.
This is not, it doesn't need to be a binary either or. You're a tradesman or you're this. Like, you can be educated for its own sake and still do your thing.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope for a future that looks like that too.
Fingers crossed.
All right. That is all I have. Do you have anything else that you feel like I might have missed? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great to have you.
All right. Appreciate it, Paige. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I really felt like Sam was such a wealth of knowledge on what it really is like to be a public school teacher, especially in a state that in recent years has not been so friendly to educators. And public education is something that I feel like gets kind of pushed to the wayside a bit, in that unless you know a public school teacher and are familiar with the day-to-day struggles, it's not really something that we as the public are really inundated with. So I really hope that after listening to this, you feel like you have a better perspective on what the day-to-day of a public school teacher is like in the current state of things. I will be back next week in the briefing room, where we'll be chatting all things chaos and confusion. And if you liked what Sam had to say, I do recommend you go and check out his podcast. That will be linked in the show notes. He's got some really interesting guests, and for someone who's not so into religion, I really liked his episode with Jordan Wood, who gave like a pretty good talk about religion as a whole, which I really appreciated. But I do recommend you go check out his podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and don't forget to thank a public school teacher. I'll see you guys next week.